All right, let's go ahead and get started, shall we?
Sounds good.
All right, I'm going to ask everyone to mute yourself and then hand it off to Lori.
Thank you. And I just want to thank everybody for inviting me back. This is obviously a very different kind of year that none of us have experienced before. And I hope you're all safe and well. It is challenging times, and I'm sure you guys have heard this before, but it's really important that you do self-care in terms of taking care of yourselves, because you can't help anybody else unless you're really, taking time to work on your own mental health and eating well and sleeping well. So please, this is an invite to you to take time and make sure that you are taking care of yourself too. So thank you and welcome to the August 2020 Tourette Syndrome parent presentation. And I think, as Mindy said, this is recorded. And we have a little poll at the beginning. So Eric, wherever you are in virtual space, if you want to put up the poll for the first one, and you just have to click. So the poll is, what are the age ranges of the children who are still at home, who are enrolled in school? So you just click on one of those and we'll get some information about our population.
All right, so I'm seeing about 6 to 12 is the majority so far. We also have teenagers in the 13 to 17 range. But a majority.
Multiple age ranges, just click twice.
Sorry, I forgot to make the first one multiple choice. Please put it in the chat.
Perfect.
Okay, so it looks like most of the kids out there are from like 6 to 12, so elementary age. All right, thank you. And I think, yep. All right, and then I think we have another poll. So what type of school setting does your child attend? So the options are general ed, a comprehensive school setting. We've got private or parochial schools, we've got charter schools, and we have non-public schools. And PS, charter schools are public, but I wanted to break them out as a separate grouping. So most of the kids so far looks like they're in your local neighborhood or a comprehensive school. Okay. All right, so most of your kids are attending a local or a public school setting. Okay, and Eric, is there one more?
I believe those are the two general ones before we
perfect.
get into the plans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Rihanna, my co-pilot, next slide. So thank you. So today, again, I'm just going to give you an overview of how students, oh, you know, Eric, there is one. Can you do the poll about special ed, the IEP or 504? Can you pop that one up? Okay, so does your child have an IEP, a 504 plan? For some of you whose kids are in private schools, some of them have accommodation plans, or they call them step plans. Okay. Thank you for contributing to this poll. It just kind of helps me guide some of the information. So it looks like 504 plans.
We have at least one family with one of each, a 504 and an IEP.
Okay. All right, so this is helpful. So we have the majority of our audience, their kids have a 504 plan, and then followed by either none or an IEP, and then possibly 8% of us have an informal learning plan. So, okay, so this is very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so since the majority of the population has a 504 and then an IEP, I will be talking about both of those plans. And again, as Mindy said, if there's specific questions, please put it in the chat and we will we'll be able to address those questions. And just briefly, what my goal is today is to talk about how students do qualify or may qualify for the IEP or the 504 if those 8% have not started that process. There have been changes in the state and federal laws as a result of COVID, so that has changed some of the procedures in terms of how schools are educating kids. Go back. I will also talk about the legal standards such as FAPE, which is a free appropriate public education, which is a standard provided both on an IEP and a 504, as well as the legal standard of LRE, which is least restrictive environment. So if you're not familiar with these terms, parents who have IEPs or 504s, these are important kind of cornerstones to the federal IEP and 504 laws. We'll talk about some tips and strategies for advocating for your child during the Corona time frame, because we're doing things differently as you're living through. Also, this is a perfect time for this presentation because it's a time for you to be able to get organized, preparing for the new school year. Mindy's also going to talk about some accommodations to support your child's learning while online. I'm assuming everybody at this point is probably going to be starting the school year remotely or virtually throughout the year. It may change to hybrid, but if California is going to be, well, is anything like what we're seeing in some of the other states, unfortunately, kids are starting school and then there are breakouts that are happening. So we may end up starting school remotely, opening up to hybrid, but we may end up pivoting back to virtual, so we'll see. But accommodations are going to be critical, and Mindy can talk about that. The other real important piece this year is you guys are your own kids' teachers, and monitoring and data collection is going to be really important because one of the pieces of information that we keep hearing about is there's learning loss. Kids are not keeping up because teachers can't teach all of the standards and all the interactions that lead to learning. Things are different this year. And if we're going to ever have to show that our kids are regressing, they're not making progress, they're not benefiting from the online platform, any of those questions or issues that are arising for our kids, we have to show data collection and monitoring. So I can talk a little bit about that. I want to try to answer any questions that you may have, and I can tell you that this is somewhat of a moving target, and the legislation keeps changing both at the state and federal level, but classrooms may be closed, but learning must continue. And right now, the legal standards for special education at the federal level there's no waivers in place for that. There was some discussion that Betsy DeVos was going to add a whole slew of waivers for districts having to provide special ed services. Those waivers did not go through. So as there are changes at the local district and state level, but our federal mandates for FAPE and appropriate education have not changed. Next slide. So you guys have seen this graphic, and you know better than I do that the motor tics, the vocal tics are the tip of the iceberg for kids with Tourette's. And there's all of these difficulties under the surface that are going on with the kids, and whether it be the handwriting difficulties, the ADHD, the rage, the anxiety, the hyperactivity, there's comorbidity, and the social communication, the OCD, all of these executive functioning challenges. For some kids, and some of my clients, actually remote learning has reduced a lot of stress, and that has actually improved the quality of kids' learning. They're not rushing off in the morning, they're getting more sleep, they're having time to do other activities. The reduction of the social stress has helped. And for other kids where they're just not organized, they can't keep a track of their time, the executive functioning skills, the keeping track of multiple things at once, it is really problematic. So there's a lot going on in terms of what's working and what's not. And during this presentation, begin to think about what's working for your kiddo. What can we capitalize that is working, and maybe we'll continue doing that in the fall and through the school year. And also what's not working. And we need to figure out how to make some changes. Next slide. So again, as we talked about, our kids are impacted with executive functioning difficulties, OCD kinds of issues, ADHD, learning disabilities, social deficits, sensory processing difficulties, handwriting. And again, some kids are doing much, much better on typing, and this is actually improving their typing fluency. So that's been a positive benefit. But we are also seeing behavioral challenges, because not only are you required to be their teacher, but now you're also their therapist and their counselor. And we are getting we're seeing some depression, we're seeing some behavioral challenges. And again, mental health issues. So there is a lot on your plate. And again, as I opened, you have to take care of yourself as well while you're dealing with all of these other real issues that are going on that impact education. Next slide. So again, many of you have lived through this. A 504 and an IEP are federal documents, and there are eligibility criteria that got your kids into the federal programs. An IEP, often the eligibility categories that we see with kids who have Tourette's could be specific learning disability, SLD, other health impairment, OHI, because Tourette's is a health condition, and also ED, emotional disturbances, if there are significant behavioral challenges, emotional dysregulation kinds of issues. So these are the kids that require specialized academic instruction over and beyond what can be done in a gen ed setting. Contrast that with the 504, and 504 are really accommodations that are provided to the students in the gen ed setting. So a 504, we look at the eligibility as having a physical or a mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activity. And learning is a major life activity. Concentrating, breathing, all that's a major life activity. And we often a doctor's letter documents that impairment and that diagnosis. Student can also be eligible if they have a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having an impairment. So again, as you know, with Tourette's and some other disabilities, the symptoms kind of wax and wane over time. And so it could be that your child is in a pretty good period at this point, regulated with medication and under good self-control, but there is still a diagnosis of Tourette's. And again, the symptoms are minimal, but they have a record of having an impairment. That could qualify them as well. So as I said, both an IEP and the 504 are federal mandates. They are programs and plans developed by a multidisciplinary team. There are assessments and LRE, the least restrictive environment mandates, with both IEP and 504. There are annual reviews and 3-year reevaluations that are required. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, because many of those timelines have been suspended. And under both the IEP and the 504, you are entitled to written notice if there's been change in the programming, or at some point the district says your child no longer qualifies for services, or that they are going to make some changes in your child's program. You're entitled to written notice, that's what it's called. And due process is also provided for both the 504 and the IEP, and that's important. So if you disagree with what the district is proposing, the district School districts, LEA, local educational agencies, have a responsibility to serve your child, to identify, there's called child find, if your child might meet a 504 or IEP, but you always have the right to say thank you, but no thank you, and have a due process hearing to argue your case. There's also, as part of due process, compliance regulations, that if the district is not meeting the standards of the 504, the way it's written, or the services of the IEP, you can file a complaint with either the Office of Civil Rights for 504 complaints, or with the Office of Administrative Hearings for IEP kinds of complaints. Next slide. So again, one of the cornerstones of 504 and an IEP is FAPE, a free appropriate public education. And every time that you all have IEP meetings or 504 meetings, you should be given a copy of your parent rights. And if you haven't looked at those in a while, they're probably uploaded on the district's website. You should be given those every time that you have a new IEP or 504, definitely every time there is a new assessment. So FAPE basically means special ed, and oh, this is IEP FAPE, special ed and related services provided at no cost to parents in conformity with the IEP. So that's, again, appropriate is the important word out of that definition of FAPE. And what's appropriate for one child is not necessarily appropriate for any other child. So we should never see two IEPs that are written exactly the same, because the needs of that child, the unique needs of that child, are going to be different. And so when we look at what constitutes appropriate, we have both procedural requirements, things have to be done at a certain time frame, and violations like IEPs were not held on an annual basis, or assessments were not done accurately, or parent participation was not included as part of the IEP process. All of those accumulated procedural compliance issues could deny your child FAPE. So that's really important to keep track of any procedural errors that you may be living through with your kids. The other issue is the substantive issues. Is your child not making benefit? Is your child not, for example, the online platform? If your child can't benefit or use the online platform, they're not getting access to the curriculum. So we want to make sure that, again, the related services that might be provided on the IEP, your child should be showing progress there, the services. So we look at both of those elements, and that constitutes FAPE. Again, parental participation is important. So they can't have meetings without you to make changes in your child's 504 or your IEP. So parental involvement is critical. And they should be rearranging IEPs and 504s to ensure your participation. And I guess the good news about this time of the pandemic, everybody's doing this on Zoom or Google Classroom, so you don't have to hopefully miss out much time on work, but they should be able to schedule this at your time. So we have another poll. Oh, this is, well, I see already 100%. Many meetings were dismissed or were not held during the first part of the pandemic or the spring. So the question that we're asking is, did the school fail to convene an IEP or a 504 that should have been held in the spring? I can tell you with LA Unified, I call it the sleeping giant. For 2 weeks, it was asleep. No meetings were held. Everything was canceled. And spring is typically the time when we have a lot of transition meetings for the little ones that are moving from we call part C to part B of our federal laws, our little ones that are moving from preschool to comprehensive school, like TK or kindergarten. We've got kids that are transitioning from elementary or middle into the next grade levels. So we lost out on a lot of transition meetings. We lost out on a lot of annual and triannual meetings. So it looks like a split between some of you did have your IEPs, which is great, and some of you didn't. So that's interesting because they have to make up those meetings that were lost. School was in session. They have to hold those meetings. So it's just a matter of when they are going to hold them. Next slide. Okay, so again, our legal standard for FAPE has grown over the years. In 2017, we had two very important decisions. One was the US Supreme Court decision in 2017, again, the Andrew F. case, which expanded the definition of appropriate. And now IEPs have to offer, now schools have to offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable to have the child make appropriate progress in light of their unique circumstances. We used to have a standard called Rowley, based on Amy Rowley case, which was a basic floor of opportunity. So if you could walk in or wheel into a classroom, that was considered access. But now we have to show, with the higher Andrew F. case, is we look at progress based on a child's unique circumstances. So it's not just walking into a classroom, but it's really, is the child progressing based on their own unique circumstances? And then in California, we had a very good hearing decision, that the Antelope Valley versus MC. So again, they use the word potential, and typically you don't hear that you don't hear it in the federal law, but our Ninth Circuit did say an IEP must be reasonably calculated to remediate and accommodate a child with a disability so that that child can make progress in the gen ed curriculum. So those are the educational standards, commensurate with his non-disabled peers, taking into account the child's potential. So again, it raised the bar a little bit further. So this is all good news. Next slide. Okay, so here's the reality of what's happened. So we did get some federal guidance, and they basically said if schools are not being offered for gen ed kids, there was no requirement to offer school for kids with disabilities. So that was an important distinction, because there were some states that actually did not provide any schooling to kids at the very, very beginning of this whole pandemic. But if schools are open for gen ed kids, they have to be open for, and they have to educate our students with disabilities and special needs. So equal access is a very important standard that we look at. So they have to have the same opportunities, the same access to the same curriculum, same amount of teaching, again, to make sure that the kids are achieving FAPE. That FAPE standard has not gone away. So it's important to keep that in mind, is what does your own student require in order to benefit educationally based on their own unique needs. And the federal guidance says once school resumes, the school district, the LEA, must make every effort to provide special ed and related services in accordance with the student's IEP, so that, again, FAPE is established. And it also included those 504 accommodations to the greatest extent possible. And we know, we've been hearing again more decisions that minute by minute services are not going to be provided. Like when school is in session, your IEP may have 5 hours of services. Well, we may not get those same 5 hours of services during the remote learning, but they still have to provide benefit to your child. And there's a fine line in the sand, how many hours of instruction will show benefit, and then if there's less than that number, would your child regress? And you guys are the teachers, and that's what you're going to have to figure out and document. Where is that line in the sand where we've got progress, or now we're showing regression? And then we have another poll here. Is remote learning successful for your child? Are they making progress, and are they accessing the curriculum? And thank you all for participating. Early results show, and I'm really happy to see this, that the majority of you guys are saying 60+%, 69% are saying yes, and 31 are saying no. So that's exciting. I would say that that is unique, and that's not the case in all with students with different kinds of disabilities. So I'm glad that it's working for most of you guys. So thank you. Okay, so, and the federal government did say that there are going to be exceptions to the circumstances about how a particular service is going to be provided. Again, LA Unified being the giant in the room is basically saying we're not going to provide any one-to-one services. And even if your child's IEP has one-to-one aides, we'll talk a little bit about kind of the workarounds for that. But there are some exceptions where services may not be provided, especially the way it was written on the child's IEP. So this guidance came out in March, and I'm sure there'll be further guidances coming out in August or September. All right, next slide. So our California State Department of Education, CDE, California Department of Ed, has actually amended some of our education codes to reflect what's going on in the pandemic. So there was an ed code change to section 43503B, and it basically ensures targeted supports and interventions for special ed students, including accommodations necessary to implement IEPs through a distance learning model, and that's what they're calling the remote teaching. So Mindy's going to talk a little bit about the accommodations that you may want to consider adding to an IEP or a 504 to support your student during the distance learning model. We also had a change in section 56345, which basically said that IEPs, there needs to be a description in the IEP of how the student's educational program, including related services, supplementary aids and services, transitions, and ESY, which is summer school, will be implemented during these certain emergency conditions, which includes a pandemic or an epidemic, during which instruction or services cannot be provided to a student for 10 consecutive days. So if a student is out of school for 10 consecutive days due to this emergency condition, the district is supposed to come up with a plan of how to educate your child. So and I'll talk a little bit about this later, one of the kind of advocacy take-homes is if your child is not doing well, for those 31% of kids that are really not benefiting from the online platform, we are recommending ask for a review IEP or a review 504. And as I've said in the past, if you don't put it in writing, it doesn't exist. So now it's as important, if not more important, to document. Just make sure everything is done in writing. And an email is documentation, and if you do send anything via email that's important, you may want to ask for a confirmation that your email was received, at least acknowledgement that they got it. And then lastly, an IEP, or there needs to be an individualized description or a protocol should be included in the IEP to consider the child's unique learning needs and how the learning plan can be implemented at home. So again, this is new language that's been added by California to address the current distance learning model. Next slide. So as I said, many districts, including LA Unified, are not providing in-home services, or in-person services. But in-home services or in-person services are possible. And if any of you all have students who are also involved in the regional center, getting regional center services and have an IPP, you know that you can actually get in-home services where people can't, or in-person services, where people can be deemed essential workers and come into your home. And so unfortunately, it's taking individual advocacy to push this agenda. And that's where your documentation is critical. where you can show, and this is for many of my students with intellectual disabilities or significant behavioral or autism, where we have to show that they are not focusing in on a screen. But we are pushing for in-person services, and there are many agencies, behavioral agencies in particular, that are actually being deemed by regional center as essential workers that are also vendored by the school district, and we are pushing on an individual basis to get people into the home. So back on April 9th, 2020, our CDE, our California Department of Ed guidance, did suggest that schools may provide in-person special ed services if, number one, the service provider is considered an essential worker, and then number two, if providing remote programming is not practical or did not work. And that's where your documentation is going to be critical. And who is an essential worker? An essential worker is defined as someone who provides support to vulnerable populations to ensure their health and well-being, including workers supporting public and private K through 12 schools for purposes of district learning. And this was State Governor Newsom did write this executive order. These are the numbers, and you can just Google these numbers. So if you are needing in-person support, these are references and supports that you can use to get that. CDE, again, California Department of Ed, stated that if an individualized determination is made that a student needs services and supports in person to maintain their mental health, their mental and physical health, and for safety purposes of supporting the student in accessing the alternative options for learning being offered, such as distant learning, the LEA is not precluded from providing that service, which means that they can indeed provide in-person services. So just to kind of give you that option and know that that's part of what you can ask for in your IEP. Next slide. Okay, somebody had, I think, asked in the chat room also, what happens to evaluations where schools are closed? And as we know, right now, most districts are not doing in-person evaluations. I do have to say that a lot of the private psychologists, the neuropsychs, have been very active in working with the testing publishing companies to change some of the standards for administrating these tests, and they are allowing tests to move forward online. So it's going to take more advocacy and it's going to take more pushing, but online testing, remote testing, is actually happening, and the testing publishers are saying that it is valid. So that's very exciting, and I think we're going to be seeing districts forced to either pay up and pay for private assessors or start providing their own. But right now, schools are not required to conduct the in-person services, the in-person evaluations, while contact is prohibited. Again, that may be changing, or there may be some workarounds that. There are extensions of that 60-day evaluation time period. Once school is back in session, that timeline is supposed to start up again, and back in session means in person. We as advocates are pushing back and saying, well, school is in session. It may not be in person, but it is in session. So for some of our kids where we've identified that there's a need and the school district has to do an assessment for an initial evaluation, we have federal guidelines that are still in place that says district, you have a federal mandate, a responsibility to do this assessment. Okay, so we have another poll, and I'll get back to what I was saying about assessments in a minute. But are you planning to have your child remain at home learning even if schools reopen? And it looks like the majority are not. And I sympathize with you all having to make that decision if and when that is happening. Our kids are vulnerable. They may be asymptomatic, but they do bring the virus home, and it is problematic. So right now, the majority are saying you're going to continue with home instruction or remote teaching. So we can talk a little bit about that. So thank you for for that. So again, evaluations are on hold. It doesn't mean that the school district is exempt from ever having to do that. If you feel an assessment is needed or that they missed the assessment, put it in writing, document, and ask. If they won't send you, if they won't conduct the assessment, then you can indicate that you will get an outside private assessment and submit the bill to them because your child is legally entitled to that assessment. Don't wait for school to be back in session, because some schools are saying they're not going to be open the full fall semester, and you may have to wait till January. For some kids, especially who haven't been identified yet as needing a 504 or an IEP, that delay could mean a loss of learning. Collect the data that shows that you need more formalized, standardized information, and that gap is widening between your child's performance and what you see is going on the other end of the screen. Child is not being able to keep up. So evaluations may be on hold by the districts, but it doesn't mean that we can't push them to get those evaluations done. And again, your child is legally entitled to those evaluations. Next slide. And if you have private evaluators, those people too are very important in terms of keeping track of data and documenting progress or regression. Again, we know distance learning can take a number of different formats. It can be interaction like what we're doing today. It could be check-ins with the teacher. It could be over the cell phone. It could be over the computer, videoing, audio instruction. I've seen teachers take wonderful snippets of YouTube or masterclass sections and infuse it into their lessons. Print. I've had kids actually, schools send home packets for kids because they can't do the lessons online. They have mobility issues, so they can't click with a mouse. We've seen, again, a number of different ways we've seen that instruction is provided, and kids give back either written form or oral feedback form. These accommodations and supports need to be included in your child's IEP to support the necessary, their necessary unique needs. And again, it all has to equal into FAPE. So these accommodations or modifications need to be documented. Next slide. Mindy, I will, we have one more one more poll. Has remote or distance learning negatively impacted your child's stress level or their daily functioning? Okay, so there has been some stress on our kids. So on top of everything else that they've got to deal with, all the new rules and changes, it's stressful. So, yep, thank you for sharing that. All right, Mindy, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that stress has been huge for kids and adults alike. I know that even those of us without our own unique needs, and I know many of us have our own unique needs as well, it's a stressful situation. And we're all kind of learning to adjust to this, what I'm preferring to call a temporary new normal, because I'm really optimistic that this is going to have an end at some point in the near future. So a lot of the discussions we've been having at camp, myself as an educator, as well as an individual with Tourette, what do we need to make our students more successful, right? So Lori spoke a lot about accommodations. Some of those accommodations need to be tweaked in IEPs and 504 meetings, and just intervention plans, that type of thing. So some of these things are what I have created for myself as an individual with Tourette syndrome to function, because I am working remotely right now. I am back at work. So I've set up my own little workspace. So what's worked for me during some chats in our camp activities, we've had some brainstorming sessions, and through various methods, I've collected some additional options. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see what Lori presented earlier, what we all know. These are all common difficulties with individuals with Tourette syndrome and all of the comorbidities, the executive function, the OCD, the attentional issues, learning deficits, social interactions, which I think is huge right now, impacted with all of us having to be socially distant. I like to call it physically distant as well, because I think social interactions are really critical for us. So I've kind of put together a brainstorming list. This is not an end-all list. This is just, you know, I tried to get everything from those common difficulties and have something addressed. So having an established workplace is going to be huge. Somewhere where your child knows, when I am here, this is where I learn. It doesn't have to be one specific location, because we know that our kids need to move. We know that I need to move. So what I have is I have an established work location in my house, but I also know that when this view for me no longer is working and I'm not being productive, I have a secondary work location that I can go to, that I also know that's another place I can go and work, have a different scenery, have a different seating arrangement or standing arrangement for myself. And so, but it is, when I'm here, I am working. So it's not the comfortable couch that I can lay down and play on my phone or watch TV. I have no other distractions. Flexible seating, that's a term that we hear a lot right now in the educational world. In the brick and mortar classrooms, you're seeing maybe some therapy balls, some sit and stand options. Those are really important for us to create in the home setting as well, for us to work. So I am currently at a standing desk. So my desk will sit and stand, and it was an investment for me because I needed it for myself. I highly recommend it, but you can also just put some books on top of your table and allow for some standing opportunity. But flexible seating is going to be important. So even if you only have that one established work location, changing and allowing that movement to happen is going to be critical for our little ones. Copies of the materials presented virtually. So I know a lot of you are asking for copies of this presentation. We want to be able to go back and look, and that's great. So our students can get copies as well. Most of these, because they're presented online, Google Classroom, I know our district uses Schoology. I know there's a lot of various platforms that are available that teachers are utilizing, and they have it electronically. So many of our teachers are making them available to our students now, which is great. Some of our meetings are able to be recorded. Know that at least in LA Unified, I know Lori and I are speaking a lot about LA Unified because that's kind of it's the second largest district in the nation, and definitely the biggest here in California, where most of us are from. We in LA Unified are not allowing recording of classroom instruction right now. There are some exceptions, but there's privacy issues. And of course, California is a two-party consent state for recording. So just be aware of that, that recordings may not be available, but it is a possibility, and it can't hurt to ask. It may be an option for your student as an accommodation, but just be prepared. That's why I have a little asterisk there, that because we're in California, two-party consent state, and of course, privacy issues, we have to be aware of that. So a timer. I'm hearing a lot of kids say, or a lot of families say, my child can only sit for 10 minutes looking at the screen. Great. Let's make those 10 minutes as important as possible and have a timer going. So when that timer goes off, make your body move. So every 10 minutes, maybe have it to a standing location. And when we as adults see our kids start to fidget, that's when we know our time frame to make those changes. So a change of scene, maybe that secondary established learning location, body placement, maybe sit versus stand, those types of things. Permission to fidget and doodle. I am constantly doing something else while I'm working, even if it's taking notes, even if it is doodling on a pad. As long as I am attending to what is happening, that's good. So I remember one of our families was asking a question about the child constantly wanting music in the background, because that's what helped her, I believe it was, function. And it drove the mom crazy, because she's like, wait a minute, I can't function when there's secondary noise around. And the child was saying, I can't function when it's quiet because everything in my head, all the thoughts are going nuts inside me, and the music settles that. So figure out what works for your child and allow that quiet background noise. I mean, I don't know if you can see, but I have my earbuds in, so it doesn't have to be affecting the people around that are listening to it, but even just an earbud, especially during remote learning, it can just kind of be covered with the hair, something along those lines. So nobody even has to know, but it's just that extra input that's calming to a lot of people. Movement breaks, we've talked a lot about that as well. We need movement breaks in regular life. I mean, how many of us are sitting this entire time? We started at 10 o'clock, it's almost an hour. If you're anything like me, I have been moving up a storm, and that is fine. So our kids need to be able to move and wiggle as well. And a lot of natural classroom instruction allows for that. Elementary school, you know, from carpet to seats to small group instruction, you're constantly moving. In secondary, middle, and high school, you have passing periods. That's constant movement breaks. It's built into our day. And so we need to figure out how to have those movement breaks within the virtual environment as well. You know, a lot of us were saying that our kids are experiencing that anxiety, that stress, that overload, just like us as adults are. So sometimes it's just too much to get those assignments done. So I know a lot of our virtual classroom platforms will give you due dates. It might be worth it to ask, hey, can I get an extension? Just like we do in regular school, time and a half, or, you know, if it's just a day that it's too much and it's not an assignment that's going to be 95% of your grade. I hope none of the assignments are that big because whoa. But those might be assignments that you can get excused or extended, especially when we're just having one of those days or one of those weeks, because we all know they happen, especially now. Calendar for backwards planning of assignments. So typically when we have a beginning of the school year, we have big projects coming up at back to school night, the teachers will create kind of a timeline for things to happen. And there's constant reminders that happen in the classroom as well. Don't forget, this is coming up. Don't forget, this is coming up. And I remember one of my friend's children when we transitioned to virtual, and she's a student, very typical, very high performing, and her eyes bulged, huge stress level up the yin yang because she couldn't figure out how to prioritize the assignments. And when the teacher gave them a list of 10 activities, it was right when the school closed, like March 13th-ish. And we had that 2-week span of, we don't know what's going on. We didn't know the world was going to end this way. Well, not end, but you know what I mean. She had this list of assignments that were supposed to keep her busy for 2 weeks. And she thought she had to finish them overnight and she was stressing out. And so we had a lot of conversations of backwards planning. No, this is a long term. Let's figure out what's easy. Let's figure out what's more difficult. And we actually got out a calendar together virtually and figured out how to backwards plan so she could do little bits every day and take breaks in between. Supports for transition. So starting Zoom, ending Zoom, excuse me. Just like we have transitions in school and in life, there needs to be some sort of a transition built in, a clear start, a clear end. If you're anything like me, if your kids are anything like me, I wake up and I use that drive time getting from home to work to get myself up and motivated. My brain starts working. But when I was working from home last semester, I rolled out of bed, took my shower, but I didn't have that wake up time before I started getting online to Zooms, and I really felt the effects of it. So I have to build in, now that I'm working remotely for part of my week, I have to build in some of that as well of where is my transition? Where am I going to build that drive time, brain processing, even if it's getting up an extra few minutes early, which I don't like to do, I'm telling you. But I was forced to when I drive, but when I'm home, it's just a commute downstairs. So I've got to figure out that commute time and how to get myself ready to learn. And then also after I get off a day of Zoom, because I'm online, I'm looking at a screen, which is horrible, and I don't recommend this, sometimes for 10 hours straight. And I have to remember my brain needs those breaks. Don't let us do that. I'm trying to improve that for myself, but I need that transition after I get off the screen time to allow my body to calm back down. My tics are definitely worse when I get off that screen. Which leads me right into screen time limits. You know, there's a lot of studies out there that looking at the screen this long is not healthy for our bodies. Our bodies were not built to take this. So there's the 20-20-20 method. If you've heard of that, it's 20 minutes of screen time, look away from the screen to a non-other device. So it's not from your computer to your phone, but it's every 20 minutes of screen time, look away for 20 seconds at a distance of 20 feet, I believe it is. So it's basically looking away from the screen, giving your eyes that break to rejuvenate, etc. And then the last one, actually one of our kids talked about this, and it made a lot of sense to me. Rihanna and I had this conversation as well. We don't like to look at ourselves ticking. It is very overwhelming because, and by the way, ticks, as you know, are contagious. And so when we see each other ticking, our ticks get worse. And then we look at ourselves and our ticks get worse. So it might be a possibility for us to turn cameras off. This was a big deal in the secondary schools because a lot of teachers felt like they were talking to black screens with maybe a name on it. And it was like that Bueller moment of there is no interaction. So there might need to be some kind of a compromise with our kiddos if they do need to turn that camera off, that will allow them to interact with the teacher, that the teacher knows they're still actively involved in the class and that they haven't walked away and started gaming on their computer or their TV screen. There is also a way on Zoom specifically that Rihanna shared with me where you can turn your own personal view off so you can see everybody else. Your camera is still technically on, but you don't see yourself. So that might be another option for our kiddos. But as we continue and go back to Lori's presentation, as you're thinking about what your kids struggled with, think about the common difficulty area that's on the left of the screen. I'm happy to brainstorm with you either in group chat or after this. You guys all have my contact information. I'll put it again into the chat room. Let's brainstorm. Let's figure this out together to make this the most successful, horrible situation that we possibly can to make our students successful. So Lori, I'm going to hand it on back to you and we can go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, that was excellent, Mindy. I appreciate sharing. And I think the important piece is whatever works for your kids. This is a very fluid list, and not all of these accommodations will work for all kids. But if you figure out and you check in with your own students, you know, what works for them, because that's the information you want to make sure gets onto these plans and then communicated to the teachers. And there's no, if it's on a plan, 504 or an IEP, there's a federal mandate that they have to allow your kids these accommodations. The other piece, Mindy talked about the movement breaks. Exercise is really important. And it could be that first thing in the morning, as Mindy said, maybe there's a walk around the block, you know, or there's some basketball or swimming or whatever you can do to get your child to start the day with some aerobics, some jump roping, some whatever, that'll get their mind in gear to learn, and having the physical exercise, maybe 2 or 3, again, 20-minute segments during the day is important, because there's no PE, there's no recess. So we got to really build that in. And again, research shows, and our school practices show, you need those physical movement breaks. You need you need to get your brain kind of recalibrated. Next slide. Okay, so now we're at the point of kind of organizing your own toolkit. And as Mindy said, she is volunteering some time, and I'd be more than happy to help out however I can to help figure out what that toolkit would look like. And you know again what your child struggles with, and what supports we could put into place to help with the learning process. Next slide, Eric or Rihanna. Okay, so again, some actions that you can start taking, and again, you're going to get access to all of these slides so you can go through them again. But as I've been harping on throughout the presentation, documentation is critical, and figuring out a way to keep track either both on a daily basis and on a weekly basis. And you're looking at things like behavior, you're looking at academic and related services, you're looking at, are the speech services or the counseling services provided as the IEP calls for? Are the IEP goals even being addressed? You've got, for your IEP, you've got a special ed case carrier who's supposed to be legally implementing these goals. For 504, you've got all of those teachers that need to be providing those accommodations. So again, you are the teacher, so you have a new baseline for your kids, and we just got to figure out how to document that. Is your kiddo able to attend for 5 minutes, and that's the threshold of their attention, or can they attend for 45 minutes? And you go back to the IEP, and it says that your child is going to be attending to a class lesson for 50 minutes and completing 90% of the work. Well, again, look at what the child is currently doing, and maybe that baseline is no longer accurate. Again, looking at attentional needs, looking at behavioral needs, looking at sensory needs. Movement is sensory. So maybe do we need to get an OT to help us figure out, do we need a different kind of chair for the student? Do we need one that rocks back and forth? Do we need, like Mindy said, a standing desk? I have a crate that I put on top of my desk, and that allows me to put my computer on top of the crate, and then I can, that's my secondary learning station. And again, if you have private practitioners that are involved with your child, OT, speech, tutors, psychologists, they can also help document if the child is thriving, if they see regression, if they see some of that stress that you guys have mentioned. Some of my kids cannot even access the online platform, and it could be due to technology issues such as the internet's not working reliably, that the device given to the kids back in the spring is no longer working. The kids may have fuddled around with some of the settings, and the machine has crashed. So that's an important thing to assess. And if you need new equipment, then that needs to be shared with the school. Request a copy of the teacher union contract. That is public information, but we've learned a lot of information because the teacher union is very, very strong, and they, in many respects, are guiding what the teachers are willing to do and not willing to do. Some related services can be provided outside of school hours if the teachers union and the contract says so. All the related services have to be done during the school hours. But you can see what agreements the districts and the teachers have agreed to. So that was, someone had forwarded me the teacher union from Burbank and one from Glendale. And again, it was very interesting. I think that was why LA Unified was the sleeping giant for so long at the beginning, because the teachers didn't agree with what the district was pushing forward.
100%, Lori. Yes.
So again, monitoring mental health, trauma, depression, withdrawal, and maybe we need a new assessment to look at mental health. Maybe we need counseling services. So don't hesitate to ask for that. A request, as I mentioned, requesting a review IEP starts with a letter, and it would just say, my child is not benefiting from this platform. I understand based on, and I gave you the education code, that a new plan needs to be developed and included in my child's IEP. I would like to develop that plan and talk about additional supports and accommodations for my students. But come armed with that data. I've got a client that takes video clippets of her son. Her son literally is a little guy. He needs to be literally wedged in between the parent and a wall and a table in order to attend to a lesson. Because if he's just sitting at a desk, he's like all over the place. He's making funny faces at the camera. He's dancing all around. So collecting the video snippets has really showed this kid is not benefiting. It's quite humorous, but he's having a good time, but he's really not gaining what the teacher is supposedly teaching. IEP meetings can be recorded. And the other provision we talked about early on is compensatory. We'll get into a little bit more, but the provision of lost learning, compensatory services. The feds did say that the district is responsible for providing comp ed. I will tell you that attorneys are gearing up for trying to figure out how to structure a case to show lost learning. Again, it's going to require documentation, but we haven't done that yet, but I will tell you that we are all collecting data. We are sharing information to say, if it's not working, we got to figure out another way, and due process may be the vehicle, either through 504 or the IEP and the IEP, to demonstrate that more needs to be done. And again, due process protections and procedures have not been waived. Next slide. So we've got a new school year coming up. So this is the time to go through and organize your files, go on Schoology and collect the last report card, collect any work samples, if there's been a medical change, new medication, all of that. You should have a notebook for your child. So that documentation is important now. You can see what happened at the end of the school year, what worked or what didn't. So now we're planning to move into this new year. Again, review your 504 and your IEP. What worked, what didn't work. Collaborate with your child. Again, your kids know what their threshold is, what works, what doesn't work, if they need additional supports and goals. So they should be a member of this discussion to figure out how we can make it better for the students. Continue, as we talked about, tracking progress and monitoring progress. And what we're looking at is, how many prompts does it take for a kiddo to either respond to the teacher or to get that task done? What is their attention span to that task? What's the level of work completion? And also those executive functioning skills that we talked about: organizing, planning, figuring out what steps need to be done in what order. All of those are potential interferences to progress. So we just need to keep track of kind of doing an analysis of looking at that progress. Is this working or not? And again, consult with your private practitioners, tutors, get their feedback, get updates. You know, you've also got your TS family here, and you've got Eric, Rihanna, you've got Mindy. They're looking at your kids on the screen, and they can give you valuable information about what the attention span is, or if a kiddo needs to be moving all the time, or it's taking them longer to process. So use their expertise also for feedback. Again, do you need a new IEP? Do we need to update the 504? And again, looking at accessing the curriculum. And the legal standards or the grade level standards, they're all printed and available online. So you can see what your child should be doing at what grade level. And you can know, oh, my kid is not knowing all the vowel sounds, or my kid doesn't know all their multiplication symbols or times tables, or my kid is not writing a 5-paragraph essay, or my kiddo's comprehension is not there. So these are areas that could potentially be turned into goals. And when we talked about assessments, the requirement for an assessment is still present. We'll have to figure out how it's going to be done, but do we need an assistive technology assessment? There are some fabulous software pieces that could be put into place. And every district has assistive technology experts. So what kind of supports for AT do we need? We talked about mental health supports. Do we need a session with a special ed teacher to teach academic support? If the kiddo is still not reading as in the 3rd grade, we got a problem, because as you see, everything is done with the expectation that a kiddo is reading. The behavioral support. Do we need to bring in an occupational therapist? Maybe we need a sit and move cushion. Maybe we need a TheraBand on the bottom of the chair legs so the kids can bounce their legs and get some sensory feedback. Do we need a weighted vest? Do we need to put a backpack on the back of a kiddo and that kind of weights them down? Do we need to put a heavy blanket over their lap? Do we need just to raise their feet? In the olden days, we used to tape telephone books like the yellow pages together. I don't know if they make the white pages or yellow pages together, but do we put a box or a crate under our kids' legs and that gets their butt, you know, a little bit more secure in the seat? These are all things that an OT potentially can help with. And reaching out to other parents. You've got a fabulous support group here. So, and as I said at the beginning, you got to care for yourself too, your own exercise, self-care. There's lots of ways also to infuse academics into what you're already doing. So whether you're cooking, have your child come in and help with recipes. There's math built in. If you're dealing with, again, planning, going to the market, coming up with lists, that's organizational skills. Looking at recipes, those are all, again, potential math skills. There are so many things that you do that are functional skills that you can help your child. Writing lists for the daily routine, schedules, get their involvement. So you've got visual lists and you can stop being the nag and you can just say, go do the list. Have them come up with a menu, build things, Legos, whatever it is. But again, some things that you're already doing, build those into daily chores, and have the child participate. So the question is, has remote or distance learning, again, negatively impacted your stress and your daily functioning? And it's what I would suspect, and it's 92%. It's most of us are impacted some way around by the distance learning. I will tell you, for me, I've thoroughly enjoyed not having to drive or commute 4 hours a day, 2 hours to get, I live near Pasadena, so it takes me 2 hours to get to UCLA or to Santa Monica, and I don't have to fight the traffic now. I'm definitely less, there's less rushing that goes on, but on the other hand, I'm not sure my advocacy is working effectively on the other side of the screen. I can't kick clients under the table, or they can't kick me. We do a lot of texting back and forth in meetings, so I don't know, again, if I'm as effective as an advocate doing my work over the screen. But it's something we're all going to have to get used to. Next slide. And again, most of this we talked about, again, organizing, reviewing your last IEP. The other things now is to look at compatible teacher match. Reaching out to the principal or the teacher from last year, or if your kids are in middle or high school, reaching out to the counselor. You want to ensure that there's some thoughtful, some thought put into selecting your child's teacher, because you really want to match the best teaching style to your child's learning style, because otherwise it's not going to be effective. And I think you have a better opportunity being distanced to have that discussion with the staff. Try to meet the staff before school starts. Again, the teacher or the related services provider, the counselor should be able to help with that introduction. Let them, writing a Dear Teacher letter or a Dear Staff letter to address your child's strengths, their challenges, identify what works, what doesn't work. Open up the lines of communication, letting them know that you are there or with a tutor to support your child, so that you set up an email communication system to let them know, again, these are the accommodations for my child. This is my child's disability. If they've never heard of what Tourette is, maybe they need an in-service. Maybe we need to do some staff training. And again, if you've got private providers or you've got your TS family here, bring in Mindy, bring in other people who can help be an advocate with you to help the staff know why certain accommodations are needed. As Mindy said, it's very appropriate to potentially turn off the screen while the kids are listening to lessons. But if the staff doesn't understand why that's happening, then they would be possibly reluctant to adding that as an accommodation. But the more they're on the team of your child, the more they understand your child's needs, hopefully the more flexible and understanding that they will be. And staff training goes on all the time. And there's in-service requirements and teacher development day, staff development day, and TS training can be infused into that time frame. And we talked about, does your child require additional assessments? And then really analyzing the technology needs, including the software and the internet. So don't hesitate to ask. You know, I see sometimes numbers of kids have to share multiple devices. That's going to be a problem. So make sure your child has a dedicated device. I also know, as Mindy said, sometimes it's really hard if you have you or people are in small apartments and there's a lot of background noise going on, or family members are going back and forth to the kitchen or the bathroom. And again, just some thought going into where that learning space should be, whether it's on the bed or a desk or somewhere where there's a little bit of privacy, because that could all also interfere with the learning process. Next slide. These are questions, as Mindy said, she hopes that this is going to be a short time or a short-term remote learning experience. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think for at least the first semester, we're probably going to be home doing remote learning, but how do we access and address the pupil's learning loss? Has my child kept up with grade level standards? What are the diagnostic tools to measure loss? How do we close that learning gap? At the end of the year, do we actually retain kids because they have not benefited? But again, if you guys are seeing positive growth going on, that's fabulous. But for those kids where there is loss, how do we mitigate that learning loss? What would comp ed, compensatory education look like? Districts may be in a position to have to extend the instructional school year. They may extend the instructional school day. Again, how do we complete those overdue assessments? We still have a federal requirement for child find. For those kids, the little ones who transitioned from preschool to school age, there are assessment requirements. Those have to be done. Those haven't been waived. Again, what does comp ed services look like? How do we calculate it? And Mindy, I know that we've got some questions in the chat, so I'll want to save some time for that. And I think Absolutely. We have one last slide is just some resources. And I'm sure, again, through your organization, you've got lots and lots. We're inundated with resources coming into our inbox all the time, but here's just a few to look at. So Mindy, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've gotten most of the questions answered. There were some questions on acronyms. So for example, assistive technology, some of our families didn't know what that was. And I've addressed that already. Some private conversations occurred.
So do you want to relate AT?
Absolutely. So before I describe AT, what I want to share with you is don't hesitate to ask. Whether it's here, whether it's during an IEP, whether it's during a 504, whether it's during a parent-teacher conference, you need to understand the acronyms that are being said. I like to refer to it as a private language, like our own little language. And so if you're a second language speaker as well, when you're in your comfort zone, when you're around your family, your friends who speak the language, you tend to default to that. And I think that's Lori and my default as well, as acronyms and shorten things. And it's very common. But it's our natural, it's not intended to keep parents out of the conversation. So if we do default to our acronym language, stop, ask questions, clarify, make sure that you know the conversations that are going on. Okay, so that's a really important piece. But assistive technology is a term that has a wide range of meanings. It's any kind of assistance, and technology is kind of a loose term in my eyes because it can be anything from low tech, such as a pencil grip. It's something that assists a child in accessing their learning. It can also be access to a Chromebook. Like right now, of course we have access to Chromebooks, but when we're in brick and mortar learning environments, when we're back in the school campuses, not every child has access to a Chromebook. So that might be a technology assessment that needs to be done to determine, can my child do better typing than writing? Me? Absolutely. My writing is atrocious. It always has been since well before I was diagnosed with Tourette. They always said I was going to be a doctor because my writing was always so bad. Little did we know that it was directly associated with the Tourette and the comorbidities. So I've always been a better typer than a writer. And so that for me was my assistive technology. When we get even into students with more impacting disabilities, we've got children who can't speak, can't communicate. Even if they have full cognition, some of our bodies get so impacted with our disabilities that there's eye gaze devices where they can look at a computer screen and type out or pick out pictures to speak on their behalf. So there's a variety of different technology that's out there. And it's a matter of what works, what are the child's needs or what are the individual's needs, and then matching to technology. There's a huge range of options out there. And I don't know if there's a list anywhere that lists everything. That was one of the questions. So if we start talking about what the needs are, there's a likelihood that there's some device out there or some support or technology out there that will be able to be matched for the child. So there are some other questions here about asking for accommodations for 504s, IEPs, et cetera. Put it in writing. And as Lori mentioned, explain why. So why do you want the video turned off? What does that mean for your child? Is it because they're embarrassed? Is it because they're not wanting to see their takes? What is the rationale for that accommodation needed? Because they're going to get a lot, the staff is going to be more on board to provide that accommodation in the 504 and IEP if you explain the why. The why factor is going to be huge. But yes, I would absolutely recommend requesting an update to the 504 or the IEP to make any accommodation requests.
You can start with the ask, but there's no mandate to have to implement that accommodation. And then again, if there's multiple teachers teaching your child, that accommodation won't go across to all the staff unless it's in writing. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is because of the climate that we're in, some of the staff may not have a copy of the child's IEP or 504. So you may have to provide that. You may want to just provide only the accommodation page for the IEP or the service page, or if you feel comfortable sharing the whole document, share that with the staff, because it may take a while for paperwork to go from teacher to teacher because administration is as fumbled up as we are.
Yeah. Another just side note is because we're still making up for a lot of the IEPs and 504s that are backlogged from last year. Something that some of my parents, I have really good relationships with my parents, really good relationships, and I've built that trust. For those of you who don't know, I'm an assistant principal supervising the special education programs here in LA. So, but what that means is when I have a request for an amendment or accommodation right now, I say to our family, let's try some of those out. Make sure that those are accommodations we want to put on, and allows us to really understand what distance learning is going to look like. And then we'll hold that IEP or 504 amendment after that. For me, they're very understanding. They do have the legal right to that IEP within 30 days. And if they want that, I will absolutely make that happen. But some families understand that because there's been a delay, we don't know if this accommodation is truly going to work in this environment. It's kind of a nice little trial period. And I have a conversation with the teachers personally to say, we're going to try this out, make sure it works before we put it in writing and you get stuck having to do something that may not be right for the child. So that's something that you may want to work with your administration. If that's something that you do have that trust that they'll follow through on the other side, it's an option for you. There are a lot of websites and resources that Lori's included. Of course, our Southern California Trade Association website is available and up and updated amazingly well, has all of our contact information on the board as well. So I'm just looking, go ahead.
One of the questions, they talk about what kind of data should you guys collect. Use your 504 or your IEP as a starting point. So you guys, for the parents whose students have IEPs, your goals are a good starting point. Look at what was expected to be completed, let's say by the end of the school year. So you can collect data if you've got goals in the areas of math or writing, collect those work samples. Again, as I mentioned in one of the slides, how much prompting does your child need? How much independence do they have, or lack of independence? Do you have to reorganize or organize their materials? All of those are potential areas of data to collect. So again, it's trying to figure out what's working and what's not working and analyzing what's not. And that's where you keep the data collection. And talk to your other friends and colleagues and say, well, my child is struggling in this area. Is this expected? Is this a grade level or age level expectation? I've seen some of these learning plans, and they're expecting little ones like 5 and 6-year-olds to sit for like a 45-minute block for a lesson. That's like, I think that expectation is like way over what developmentally what a little 5 or 6-year-old can handle. So, just checking in with others. But where I think you're looking at those interferences, that's where you begin to collect the data, as well as if services are supposed to be provided and they're not. So if speech is on your IEP or OT or adapted PE, if those services are not being provided, collect the data. How often are they coming or not coming?
Lori, can we also talk about a couple other things? So services being provided or not provided. I know a lot of districts are sending out prior written notice letters and developing individual instruction plans. Do you mind speaking briefly about those?
Yes, and I will say those are not potentially amendments to the IEP. Districts are sending out prior written notices or distance learning plans. And they are supposedly outlining what they're going to be doing or how they're going to implement services. LA Unified has not, their prior written notices have not been individualized. It's been at least what I'm seeing is like a boilerplate letter that's been sent out to everybody. Some districts have done, like Culver City has done a fabulous job of really tailoring that letter and that notice to parents about how distance learning is going to be different than what the IEP calls for. The IEP, unless it's written in the IEP or 504 format, and unless it's got permission by the parent to make those changes, to me, the IEP has not changed. So you do have due process. If you don't agree with what the district is proposing, then call for a new IEP or a new 504, and then bring those changes into the IEP, talk about them. But if you're still in disagreement that those services will not constitute FAPE, constitute a free appropriate public education, then you can dispute those and go through due process. Again, there's a fine line in the sand where if you do so much support and so much work, your child will benefit and will see growth. And then if there is lack of services or there's not enough, then the child will not keep up with his or her peers or keep up with what the IEP team said in their contract, that this is what we expect your child to be doing. So that's where I think, again, I go back to documentation. But yes, the districts are sending out prior written notices and these plans, but again, they can't, I don't feel that they, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an attorney, but they don't replace the IEP.
Another question that came up is for those families that are choosing to do more of an independent study or a homeschooling option, how does that affect the IEP 504 accommodations process? I'm thinking it might be related to like private school policy, but I'm not 100%. So I was wondering if you could address that.
Well, it's very interesting because there's a lot of creativity that's going on now with these learning pods and parents taking their kids out of school. There's compulsory education. So if you're thinking about not having your child attend whatever school, just know that age 6 through 18, your kids have to be enrolled in a school situation. It's compulsory ed. So, and if you take your child out, you have to sign up either with the school or sign up as a home teacher with the state of California. There is a whole process to establish that you're providing a reputable program. I have a family that actually decided they're both independent contractors and they're just going to travel for the year, and they took their kids out of school. So if you're in a public, like LA Unified offers K-12, which is a online public program, and there are online virtual charter schools. Those public online programs have to implement the IEP and the 504. And typically when you move into those private or those, actually not even private, into those online, those public charters or magnets, they have to do a review IEP within 30 days. So your IEP that you're coming into that school with is reviewed, and then the services are adapted for that format. So if you're moving to a parochial school, a private school, there is no legal mandate to implement the IEP or the 504 unless they collect federal funds, and then there are some federal requirements. So I know I'm being kind of convoluted, but private schools don't implement, private or parochial do not implement IEPs. If they, again, they have any kind of federal dollars, they may have their own STEP or learning plan. They will adopt aspects of the IEP or the 504 to their own setting. And if they do collect any federal mandate or have federal lunch programs, they have to make accommodations. But otherwise, the IEPs are not, there's no requirement to implement an IEP in a private school.
Thank you. There were some questions about independent assessments, who does them and how much do they typically cost? I think I got that about right. Timelines related to assessments right now. Go ahead.
Okay, so with regard to an independent assessment, you need to make the ask first. I would say that either the district is out of compliance because they didn't do their assessment, or you've recognized a new need, whether it be assistive technology or occupational therapy or an academic assessment. Make the ask, have the district respond to you, and that we've been talking about is called a prior written notice. So that response needs to come to you. If you have not gotten the prior written response, make your ask again. And then if you still are getting radio silence, you can send them an email that we are going to secure an independent educational evaluation. In our language, it's an IEE, independent educational evaluation, and to secure an assessment that we feel is critical to our child's learning. I would try to get that paid for by your insurance company. Those are expensive. If you can prove that the district was out of compliance, that's the procedural error, or that the assessment, the district's assessment was not appropriate, there are ways to actually get reimbursement for that assessment. But typically you have to pay those out. For some assessments, such as like a full neuropsychological evaluation, neuropsych, that could be like a $5,000 assessment. But if you're looking for, let's say, an assistive technology assessment or solely an academic, those would be less expensive. But you want to make sure that they're administered by credentialed, licensed staff, and that those staff are going to pull together a report, going to review records, going to actually see your child, and again, it could be remotely, and that a report will be generated, and that person will be able to defend that report going to an IEP meeting.
So yeah, if I can just add to that, with independent assessments, it is a gamble, unfortunately, for our families to lay out that amount of money, and it's a huge amount of money. I guesstimated for the psych assessments anywhere from 3 to 8, and OT, LAS assessment, that kind of thing, usually around 800-900 is what I've seen. So they're expensive. They're a lot of money, and the law actually states that the district only has 2 options once an independent assessment is requested, and that is to pay for that assessment or to file in court their own due process to defend their own assessment. Of course, that only happens when we have an assessment, right? So if we don't have an assessment to defend, it's a little bit harder. But it is a gamble for families, and a lot of districts recently are starting to push back on their own assessments. It used to be a lot easier for families to get that reimbursement, and I'm hearing a lot more court cases and decisions or filings about that. So I don't want us to needlessly spend the money, but it might be necessary to front that money if it's appropriate. So just be, sorry, Siri just decided to talk to me. So just be cognizant of, what you're willing to pay and not pay, because it's not a guarantee, unfortunately. All right, we're at 11:30. I haven't seen too many questions. There was a question, should we, a senior, sorry, Siri keeps thinking I'm talking to her. Senior, do I want to go through the assessment process? I always recommend requesting the assessment regardless of our circumstance. Put it in writing, make sure that at least that need is known. Hopefully a 504 or whatever else is working for them now is great, but don't just not request assessment because of our situation.
Can I jump in there? The importance
Please.
for a senior is the IEP or 504 can be used for college support. So the form actually changes. Colleges who get federal dollars are also mandated to implement some kind of accommodation plan. So the 504 or IEP could be looked at by the Student Disability Center, and it could provide students with a lot of supports at that level, such as tutoring support or those accommodations we talked about, also preferential class selection. So there is a benefit to having a legal document, including, as there's a lot of controversy about the SAT or ACT tests, but a 504 plan or an IEP can also get you accommodations for those standardized tests. And that's done through the high school counselor to help get those extended time or location provisions looked at and adjusted.
All right. I think I got all of the questions answered. If I didn't, I apologize. It's my multitasking inability. But please, I'm going to put my email address in there again. If I didn't answer your question by mistake, please email it to me. I want to make sure to get your questions answered. I want to thank you, Lori, so much. You have donated your time every year, and it is so beneficial to have your expertise and your knowledge.
Thank you for joining me and being my co-pilot, and thank you to all of you guys for taking your time to participate. And I'm glad that I could share my information with you. Absolutely. And thank you for Eric and Rihanna for being my co-pilots today and making this run so well.
Thank you, everyone. So glad you came.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Mindy, you've got my number if there's any questions if parents have to come back.
Absolutely. I will connect. Thank you so much, Lori. Always helpful.
Bye, everybody.
Happy Saturday.